بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This lecture is about the pharyngeal arches, which are paired structures associated with the pharynx. They contribute to the formation of face, jaw, ear, and neck. They are defined as series of 5 paired swellings that surround the embryonic foregut. They are wedged between the developing heart and the brain. As I mentioned, they give structures of the head and neck region. They are formed by cells that derived from ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm, and neurocrest cells. As you can see in this picture, this is the developing brain, and this is the stomodium or the primitive mouth cavity. Here is the site of the pharyngeal arches. They are paired structures on both sides. Usually the fifth arch regresses before development is complete. So these arches are numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. The reason for this numbering is that some vascular component of the fifth pharyngeal arch develops transiently and then it is lost and disappears. So the numbering includes only 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. The 5 is missing. As you can see in this figure, these are the pharyngeal arches. This is 1, this is the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Externally, you can see only 4 pairs of these arches. Actually, the arches are mesenchymal tissues surrounded by ectoderm and endoderm. Externally, the ectoderm, internally, the endoderm. The clefts or grooves, they separate adjacent arches along the ectodermal surface, so the pharyngeal clefts are outside the structures, whereas the pouches, they are internally or medially. Each of the pharyngeal arches is separated by a pharyngeal pouch. Here, these are the arches. You can see these 4 arches, and this is the outer surface, and this is the inner surface. The outer surface between arch 1, 2, and each of these arches is the clefts. The clefts are numbered according to the numbers of the arches. You can see here arch number 1 and 2. Between them is the cleft 1, cleft 2, also between arch 2 and 3, and so on. This is the external surface. Whereas the internal surface, these structures which meet the clefts is named the pouch. Each pouch meet clefts. Also the numbers depends on the number of the previous arch. So this is the first pouch between 1 and 2, the second pouch between 2 and 3, and so on. Usually the arches develop in a rostral to caudal sequence during human and all the vertebrate development. As I mentioned, they are pairs. They project forward from the back of the embryo toward the front of the face and neck. Each arch develops its own artery, nerve that controls distinct muscle groups and skeletal tissues. So the components of each arch include an artery, nerve, muscles, and bone. These arches grow and join in the ventral midline of the embryo. Now, the first pharyngeal arch is the first to form. It separates the mouth pit or stomodium from the pericardium, or the developing heart. The first arch appears at about the beginning of the 4th week of development. Then it's followed by the appearance of other arches. They appear more caudally later, such that there are ultimately 5 arches by the end of the 4th week of development. The pouches approach the corresponding bronchial clefts, as you can see here. This represents arches and pouches and clefts. Each arch composed of this is the cleft from the outside surface covered by ectoderm. This is the pouch from the inside covered by endoderm. Each of these arches have the same component, which are the artery, cartilage, and nerve. Now, this structure represents the pharyngeal membrane, which is the approximation of the ectoderm from the outside with the endoderm from the inside, representing the pharyngeal membrane. So each pharyngeal apparatus is composed actually of pharyngeal arches, clefts, pouches, and membranes. Here is a scanning microscope of an embryo. You can see this is the frontonasal prominence or the head region. This is the primitive mouth cavity surrounded by the first pharyngeal arch. It's number 1 here. The first pharyngeal arch gives the maxilla and the mandible. Second pharyngeal arch, third and fourth. Actually, you can see only 4 arches externally on the body of the embryo. This is the heart. As I mentioned, that this is the developing brain and this is the developing heart. Here are the pharyngeal arches squished between them. They are paired structures from both sides. Here again, these are the 4 pairs of arches. You can see only one side. From the outside between first, second, third, and fourth, these structures are named the pharyngeal clefts from the outside. They meet the pharyngeal pouches from the inside. You can see these are the arches again. This is the outside structure. Here are the clefts. This area represents the clefts corresponding to the pouches, and approximation of this area at this side represents the pharyngeal membrane. You can see all the arches have the same component on both sides. This is the cartilage, nerve, and artery. And this is the membrane, approximating the ectoderm from the outside and the endoderm from the inside. Each arch, as I mentioned, contains cartilage, muscle, artery, and nerve. Here is this again. These are the components of each arch. It is the same for each pharyngeal arch. Now, each of these arches give certain structures. For example, the first pharyngeal arch, or the bronchial arch, is the other name of the pharyngeal arch. It's named the mandibular arch. It gives maxillary process and mandibular process. This is the maxilla and mandible on both sides. They are derived from the first pharyngeal arch. Other components, malleus and incus of the middle ear, and nerves, the trigeminal nerve. The blood supply is the maxillary artery. Muscles include muscles of mastication, mylohyoid, anterior bale of digastric, tensor tympanic, and tensor palatine muscles. Now, the second bronchial or pharyngeal arch, it gives richest cartilage. The dorsal part of it becomes stapes and styloid processes. Gives also stylohyoid ligament, lesser horn or lesser corner of the hyoid, and part of the body of the hyoid bone. The muscles are the muscles of facial expression. They are regarded as the muscles of the second pharyngeal arch. Other structures, stapedius muscle, stylohyoid muscle, and posterior belly of digastric, since the anterior belly is derived from the first pharyngeal arch, whereas the posterior belly of digastric from the second pharyngeal arch. The hyoid artery and stapedial arteries, they supply the structures that are derived from the second pharyngeal arch. Facial nerve is the nerve of the structures that are derived from the second pharyngeal arch. Third arch, the cartilage component, is located, forms the lower half of the body and the greater horn or the greater cornea of the hyoid bone. Muscles is the style of pharyngeal muscle. The blood supply is through the common carotid, external carotid, and proximal internal carotid. Nerve supply is the glossopharyngeal. And so as the fourth branchial or pharyngeal arch gives the thyroid cartilage, the three pharyngeal constrictors, the cricothyroid muscle, supplied by the aortic arch and the right subclavian artery. Nerve is through superior laryngeal branch of vagus nerve. Now the sixth pharyngeal or branchial arch, the cartilage's structure is cricoid cartilage, arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform. The muscles are the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. Blood supply, the left pulmonary artery, ductus arteriosus. Right is the pulmonary artery. Nerve supplies recurrent laryngeal nerve of the vagus nerve. Now the fate of pharyngeal arches. These pharyngeal or branchial arches contribute to the formation, as I mentioned, to the face and nasal cavities, mouth, larynx, pharynx, and neck. During the fifth week of development, the second pharyngeal arch, this is the second pharyngeal arch, enlarges and overgrows the third and fourth arches, forming the ectodermal depression called the cervical sinus here. By the end of the seventh week, the second to fourth pharyngeal grooves, second, 3, and 4, these grooves and the cervical sinus will have disappeared, giving the neck a smooth contour, as you can see here. This is cervical sinus at the beginning. It forms due to the overgrowth of the second pharyngeal arch. It will cover or overgrowth the second, third, and fourth pharyngeal clefts, forming the cervical sinus. At the end of the seventh week, all these will disappear and gives a smooth contour with the disappearance of this sinus. This figure shows some of the derivatives of the branchial or pharyngeal arches. This color represents the first pharyngeal arch and its derivatives. This is the cartilage, these are the small bones, malleus and incus. Now the second pharyngeal arch, you can see the lesser horn and the upper part of the body of the hyoid bone, and whereas the lower part of the body of the hyoid bone and the greater horn are derivatives of the third pharyngeal arch. This is the red color represents the third pharyngeal arch, and this is the fourth pharyngeal arch, and this is the sixth one. Clefts, we have 4 clefts. The second and fourth clefts become buried by the overgrowth of the second pharyngeal arch, as I mentioned before, to form the cervical sinus. Later on disappears during development when the embryo reaches 7 weeks of age. Only the first cleft persists and invades the mesenchyme opposite the first pouch, whereas the second, third, and fourth will disappear, as I mentioned. You can see here, this is the first cleft, where at the second, third, and fourth, all of these will disappear, only this one will remain. Gives the external auditory meatus. Now the first pharyngeal pouch, which is lined by the endoderm, it will give the middle ear, mastoid antrum, inner ear of the tympanic membrane. It elongates to the tubotympanic recess, and the distal part of it contacts the first pharyngeal cleft, forming the inner lining of the tympanic membrane. The tubotympanic recess becomes the tympanic cavity and mastoid antrum. The connection of the recess with the pharynx becomes the Stickney tube. Second pharyngeal pouch forms the tonsillar fossa. The endoderm forms the surface epithelium and lining of the tensile crypts. Later on, the palatine tonsils. The third pharyngeal pouch forms two diverticula, dorsal and ventral. The dorsal gives the inferior parathyroid, while the ventral gives lobules of the thymus. These they become detached from the wall of the migratory and migrate caudally. The thymus comes to lie in the superior mediastinum. Now, some of the anomalies appear during development of these bronchial arches, as the bronchial cyst, considered as the most common anomaly. These cysts are the most common bronchial arch anomalies, arise from the second and third arches. The remnant of pharyngeal clefts 2 and 4, they appear in the form of cervical cysts or fistula. They are found alongside the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Here you can see this is a sternocleidomastoid muscle. This cyst or fistula can appear at any one of these points. Thank you for your listening.